You are lying there, eyes closed, drifting into that hazy space where stories sound less like lessons and more like the rhythm of breathing. Imagine yourself in Greece, thousands of years ago. The air is still warm from the day, carrying the faint smell of olives and dust. In the distance, a shepherd calls to his flock, not because anything interesting is happening, but because it is the kind of thing that needs to be done every single day. The Greeks, like so many before them, lived in a world where the boring details were often the most important. One of those details, strangely enough, was a herd of cows. And this is where we begin, with Hermes. Hermes, the god who could not resist taking things that weren't his. The Greeks remembered him not as a grand hero or a mighty warrior, but as someone who always seemed to be sneaking around. Cows that belonged to his brother, Apollo, even on the day of his birth, had no patience for such order. Hermes was born in a cave on Mount Selene, in Arcadia, not in a palace, not in some radiant hall of marble, but in a dark and damp place that smelled of stone and soil. His mother was Maia, a nymph so shy that she rarely spoke even to the other gods. She had taken refuge in the cave, avoiding the chaos of Olympus. This is where Hermes came into the world. According to the Homeric hymn to Hermes, something unusual happened almost immediately. Unlike most infants, Hermes did not spend his first day crying. He spent it plotting. Imagine that, a god, still wrapped in swaddling cloth, already restless. Before the day was done, he had slipped from the cradle and set his eyes on adventure. Now, about cows, of all things. For us, cows might not sound exciting. They are slow, heavy animals, trudging through fields and chewing endlessly. But in the ancient world, they were the measure of wealth. Cows provided milk, hides, meat, and labor. To steal someone's herd was not only theft, it was an insult, a challenge to one's honor. Apollo's cows were not just any herd. They were divine, glowing with a kind of mythic presence. They grazed near Pieria, a region north of Mount Olympus, watched carefully by Apollo's servants. It was these cows, shining and ordinary at the same time, that Hermes decided to take. What makes the story almost comical is the way Hermes went about it. He did not rush in with strength like Heracles might. Instead, he turned to tricks. He reversed the hooves of the cows so that their tracks pointed in the wrong direction. He wore sandals made from branches to disguise his own footprints. It was elaborate, almost petty, in the level of detail. He was not just stealing, he was outsmarting. And remember, this was still the first day of his life. The hymn tells us that Hermes, still an infant, crept out of the cave while Maia slept. He moved quickly, as though he already knew the paths of the world. His small body carried him to Pieria, where the cows grazed. There, he drove them away, carefully reversing their hooves and leading them backward so that Apollo would not know where they had gone. Think about that image, but they also understood the meaning behind it. Hermes was not a god of brute force nor of law. He was the god of cunning, of the sideways glance, of the trick no one expected. Along the way, Hermes encountered an old man working in the fields. Instead of being afraid, Hermes simply threatened him, warning him not to tell anyone what he had seen. Even as a baby, Hermes was a master of intimidation wrapped in charm. The cows continued forward. Hermes did not simply steal the cows. On his way back, he did something even more unexpected. He stopped, killed one of the cattle, and offered its meat in a kind of makeshift sacrifice. From the entrails, he crafted something new, a lyre. The body was made from a tortoise shell, its strings from sheep gut. The irony is sharp here. Hermes created something beautiful, but not for himself. A story about cows became a story about music, about invention born from mischief. Of course, Apollo was not blind. He noticed quickly that his cows were missing. Their absence was not just an inconvenience, it was a violation. The god of prophecy, music, and order could not allow such chaos to go unanswered. He searched for the herd, following the tracks, but he soon realized something was wrong. The footprints did not make sense. They seemed reversed, leading him in circles. Frustration grew. The detail of reversed hooves is almost boring in its smallness, but that is the point. The Greeks wanted you to imagine Apollo bending down, scanning the dirt, confused by the petty genius of a baby god. Finally, Apollo found the old man who had seen Hermes. The man hesitated, clearly frightened. Apollo pressed him, but the old man could not give a clear answer. He was too afraid of Hermes' warning. Even the truth seemed tangled in trickery. Apollo eventually made his way to Maia's cave, where Hermes lay swaddled, pretending to be asleep. Imagine the scene: the radiant Apollo, tall and golden, stepping into the damp shadows of the cave, looking down at a baby. "Where are my cows?" he demanded. Hermes, opening his innocent eyes, denied everything. He was just a child, he insisted, incapable of such deeds. His voice was soft, almost mocking, as though he enjoyed the absurdity of it. The hymn describes this exchange with a kind of dry humor. Hermes was not only lying, he was lying with style. He argued that he was too young even to know what a cow was, too young to walk, too young to steal. Apollo, of course, knew better, but the situation was so strange, so ridiculous, that even Apollo struggled to respond. The matter could not remain between brothers. Eventually, the dispute was taken before Zeus, the father of both gods. Hermes was carried to Olympus, still wrapped like a child, and placed before the king of the gods. Zeus listened, his face unmoved. He had seen countless disputes before, many of them bloody and tragic. But this, a newborn accused of cow theft, must have seemed almost refreshing. Apollo demanded justice. Hermes denied everything, smiling all the while. Zeus, rather than punish, laughed. He saw in Hermes not just a thief, but a spark of something useful: cleverness, adaptability, a wit that could serve the gods in ways brute force could not. It was Zeus who ordered Hermes to return the cows, but he did so with amusement, not anger. This was not a crime to be punished, but a lesson to be remembered. And so, the first pattern of Hermes' life was set. He would always walk between truth and lies, between order and chaos. He would be the god of thieves and merchants, of travelers and messengers, of those who lived not by strength but by wit. But this first story was not finished yet, because even after being caught, Hermes was not truly punished. Instead, he found a way to twist the situation further, offering Apollo something that would change the relationship between them forever. You can almost hear the silence of that cave. Apollo, standing tall and angry. Hermes, tiny and smiling. Zeus, laughing softly in the background, the stolen cows grazing outside. It is not the kind of scene you expect from mythology, just a trick, a theft, and a question of what will come next. Because what Hermes offered Apollo was not just the return of the cows. He offered something else, something that would alter the balance between the brothers, between order and trickery, between music and theft. But what was it? And why would Apollo, the god of light and prophecy, accept such a gift from the trickster who had just humiliated him? You are lying there, eyes closed, drifting into that hazy space where stories sound less like lessons and more like the rhythm of breathing. Imagine yourself in Greece, thousands of years ago. The air is still warm from the day, carrying the faint smell of olives and dust. In the distance, a shepherd calls to his flock, not because anything interesting is happening, but because it is the kind of thing that needs to be done every single day. The Greeks, like so many before them, lived in a world where the boring details were often the most important. One of those details, strangely enough, was a herd of cows. And this is where we begin, with Hermes. Hermes, the god who could not resist taking things that weren't his. The Greeks remembered him not as a grand hero or a mighty warrior, but as someone who always seemed to be sneaking around. He is best known as a messenger, but the first story about him, the very first, is about cows. Cows that belonged to his brother Apollo. Cows that represented not just wealth, but order, responsibility, and divine authority. But Hermes, even on the day of his birth, had no patience for such order. He was born in a cave on Mount Selene in Arcadia, not in a palace, not in some radiant hall of marble, but in a dark and damp place that smelled of stone and soil. His mother was Maia, a nymph, so shy that she rarely spoke even to the other gods. She had taken refuge in the cave, avoiding the chaos of Olympus. This is where Hermes came into the world. According to the Homeric hymn to Hermes, something unusual happened almost immediately. Unlike most infants, Hermes did not spend his first day crying. He spent it plotting. Imagine that a god, still wrapped in swaddling cloth, already restless. Before the day was done, he had slipped from the cradle and set his eyes on adventure. Now, the story could have been told as a heroic beginning. Instead, it became a story about theft, about cows, of all things. For us, cows might not sound exciting. They are slow, heavy animals, trudging through fields and chewing endlessly. But in the ancient world, they were the measure of wealth. Cows provided milk, hides, meat, and labor. To steal someone's herd was not only theft, it was an insult, a challenge to one's honor. Apollo's cows were not just any herd. They were divine, glowing with a kind of mythic presence. They grazed near Pieria, a region north of Mount Olympus, watched carefully by Apollo's servants. It was these cows, shining and ordinary at the same time, that Hermes decided to take. What makes the story almost comical is the way Hermes went about it. He did not rush in with strength, like Heracles might. Instead, he turned to tricks. He reversed the hooves of the cows so that their tracks pointed in the wrong direction. He wore sandals made from branches to disguise his own footprints. It was elaborate, almost petty, in the level of detail. He was not just stealing, he was outsmarting. And remember, this was still the first day of his life. The hymn tells us that Hermes, still an infant, crept out of the cave while Maia slept. He moved quickly, as though he already knew the paths of the world. His small body carried him to Pieria, where the cows grazed. There he drove them away, carefully reversing their hooves and leading them backward so that Apollo would not know where they had gone. Think about that image. But they also understood the meaning behind it. Hermes was not a god of brute force, nor of law. He was the god of cunning, of the sideways glance, of the trick no one expected. Along the way, Hermes encountered an old man working in the fields. Instead of being afraid, Hermes simply threatened him, warning him not to tell anyone what he had seen, even as a baby. Hermes was a master of intimidation wrapped in charm. The old man kept quiet. The cows continued forward. Hermes did not simply steal the cows. On his way back, he did something even more unexpected. He stopped, killed one of the cattle, and offered its meat in a kind of makeshift sacrifice. From the entrails, he crafted something new, a lyre. The body was made from a tortoise shell, its strings from sheep gut. This instrument, small and unassuming, would go on to become one of the most important symbols of Apollo himself. The irony is sharp here. Hermes created something beautiful, but not for himself. Eventually, it would belong to the very brother he had just stolen from. The Greeks loved these little ironies. A story about cows became a story about music, about invention born from mischief. Of course, Apollo was not blind. He noticed quickly that his cows were missing. Their absence was not just an inconvenience, it was a violation. The god of prophecy, music, and order could not allow such chaos to go unanswered. He searched for the herd, following the tracks, but he soon realized something was wrong. The footprints did not make sense. They seemed reversed, leading him in circles. Frustration grew. The detail of reversed hooves is almost boring in its smallness, but that is the point. The Greeks wanted you to imagine Apollo bending down, scanning the dirt, confused by the petty genius of a baby god. Finally, Apollo found the old man who had seen Hermes. The man hesitated, clearly frightened. Apollo pressed him, but the old man could not give a clear answer. He was too afraid of Hermes' warning. Even the truth seemed tangled in trickery. Apollo eventually made his way to Maia's cave, where Hermes lay swaddled, pretending to be asleep. Imagine the scene: the radiant Apollo, tall and golden, stepping into the damp shadows of the cave. Looking down at a baby. "Where are my cows?" he demanded. Hermes, opening his innocent eyes, denied everything. He was just a child, he insisted, incapable of such deeds. His voice was soft, almost mocking, as though he enjoyed the absurdity of it. The hymn describes this exchange with a kind of dry humor. Hermes was not only lying, he was lying with style. He argued that he was too young even to know what a cow was, too young to walk, too young to steal. Apollo, of course, knew better, but the situation was so strange, so ridiculous, that even Apollo struggled to respond. The matter could not remain between brothers. Eventually, the dispute was taken before Zeus, the father of both gods. Hermes was carried to Olympus, still wrapped like a child, and placed before the king of the gods. Zeus listened, his face unmoved. He had seen countless disputes before, many of them bloody and tragic. But this, a newborn, accused of cow theft, must have seemed almost refreshing. Apollo demanded justice. Hermes denied everything, smiling all the while. Zeus, rather than punish, laughed. He saw in Hermes not just a thief, but a spark of something useful: cleverness, adaptability, a wit that could serve the gods in ways brute force could not. It was Zeus who ordered Hermes to return the cows, but he did so with amusement, not anger. This was not a crime to be punished, but a lesson to be remembered. And so, the first pattern of Hermes' life was set. He would always walk between truth and lies, between order and chaos. He would be the god of thieves and merchants, of travelers and messengers, of those who lived not by strength but by wit. But this first story was not finished yet, because even after being caught, Hermes was not truly punished. Instead, he found a way to twist the situation further, offering Apollo something that would change the relationship between them forever. You can almost hear the silence of that cave. Apollo, standing tall and angry. Hermes, tiny and smiling. Zeus, laughing softly in the background. The stolen cows grazing outside. It is not the kind of scene you expect from mythology. There is no grand battle, no thunderous climax, just a trick, a theft, and a question of what will come next. Because what Hermes offered Apollo was not just the return of the cows. He offered something else, something that would alter the balance between the brothers, between order and trickery, between music and theft. But what was it? And why would Apollo, the god of light and prophecy, accept such a gift from the trickster who had just humiliated him? You are lying there, eyes closed, drifting into that hazy space where stories sound less like lessons and more like the rhythm of breathing. Imagine yourself in Greece, thousands of years ago. The air is still warm from the day, carrying the faint smell of olives and dust. In the distance, a shepherd calls to his flock, not because anything interesting is happening, but because it is the kind of thing that needs to be done every single day. The Greeks, like so many before them, lived in a world where the boring details were often the most important. One of those details, strangely enough, was a herd of cows. And this is where we begin, with Hermes. Hermes, the god who could not resist taking things that weren't his. The Greeks remembered him not as a grand hero or a mighty warrior, but as someone who always seemed to be sneaking around. He is best known as a messenger, but the first story about Himtha, very first, is about cows. Cows that belonged to his brother Apollo. Cows that represented not just wealth, but order, responsibility, and divine authority. But Hermes, even on the day of his birth, had no patience for such order. He was born in a cave on Mount Selene in Arcadia, not in a palace, not in some radiant hall of marble, but in a dark and damp place that smelled of stone and soil. His mother was Maia, a nymph, so shy that she rarely spoke even to the other gods. She had taken refuge in the cave, avoiding the chaos of Olympus. This is where Hermes came into the world. According to the Homeric hymn to Hermes, something unusual happened almost immediately. Unlike most infants, Hermes did not spend his first day crying. He spent it plotting. Imagine that a god, still wrapped in swaddling cloth, already restless. Before the day was done, he had slipped from the cradle and set his eyes on adventure. Now, the story could have been told as a heroic beginning. Instead, it became a story about theft, about cows, of all things. For us, cows might not sound exciting. They are slow, heavy animals, trudging through fields and chewing endlessly. But in the ancient world, they were the measure of wealth. Cows provided milk, hides, meat, and labor. To steal someone's herd was not only theft, it was an insulted challenge to one's honor. Apollo's cows were not just any herd, they were divine, glowing with a kind of mythic presence. They grazed near Pieria, a region north of Mount Olympus, watched carefully by Apollo's servants. It was these cows, shining and ordinary at the same time, that Hermes decided to take. What makes the story almost comical is the way Hermes went about it. He did not rush in with strength, like Heracles might. Instead, he turned to tricks. He reversed the hooves of the cows so that their tracks pointed in the wrong direction. He wore sandals made from branches to disguise his own footprints. It was elaborate, almost petty, in the level of detail. He was not just stealing, he was outsmarting. And remember, this was still the first day of his life. You are lying there, eyes closed, drifting into that hazy space where stories sound less like lessons and more like the rhythm of breathing. Imagine yourself in Greece, thousands of years ago. The air is still warm from the day, carrying the faint smell of olives and dust. In the distance, a shepherd calls to his flock. The Greeks, like so many before them, lived in a world where the boring details were often the most important. One of those details, strangely enough, was a herd of cows. And this is where we begin with Hermes. Hermes, the god who could not resist taking things that weren't his. The Greeks remembered him not as a grand hero or a mighty warrior, but as someone who always seemed to be sneaking around. He is best known as a messenger, but the first story about him, the very first, is about cows. Cows that belonged to his brother Apollo. Cows that represented not just wealth, but order, responsibility, and divine authority. But Hermes, even on the day of his birth, had no patience for such order. He was born in a cave on Mount Selene in Arcadia, not in a palace, not in some radiant hall of marble, but in a dark and damp place that smelled of stone and soil. His mother was Maia, a nymph, so shy that she rarely spoke, even to the other gods. She had taken refuge in the cave, avoiding the chaos of Olympus. This is where Hermes came into the world. According to the Homeric hymn to Hermes, something unusual happened almost immediately. Unlike most infants, Hermes did not spend his first day crying. He spent it plotting. Imagine that a god, still wrapped in swaddling cloth, already restless. Before the day was done, he had slipped from the cradle and set his eyes on adventure. Instead, it became a story about theft. They are slow, heavy animals, trudging through fields and chewing endlessly. But in the ancient world, they were the measure of wealth. Cows provided milk, hides, meat, and labor. They were divine, glowing with a kind of mythic presence. They grazed near Pieria, a region north of Mount Olympus, watched carefully by Apollo's servants, that Hermes decided to take. What makes the story almost comical is the way Hermes went about it. He did not rush in with strength, like Heracles might. Instead, he turned to tricks. He reversed the hooves of the cows so that their tracks pointed in the wrong direction. He wore sandals made from branches to disguise his own footprints. It was elaborate, almost petty, in the level of detail. And remember, this was still the first day of his life. You are lying there, eyes closed, drifting into that hazy space where stories sound less like lessons, and more like the rhythm of breathing. Imagine yourself in Greece, thousands of years ago, is the kind of thing that needs to be done every single day. One of those details, strangely enough, was a herd of cows. And this is where we begin, with Hermes. Hermes, the god who could not resist taking things that weren't his. The Greeks remembered him not as a grand hero or a mighty warrior, but as someone who always seemed to be sneaking around. He is best known as a messenger. But the first story about him, the very first, is about cows. Cows that belonged to his brother Apollo. Cows that represented not just wealth, but order, responsibility, and divine authority. But Hermes, even on the day of his birth, had no patience for such order. He was born in a cave on Mount Selene in Arcadia, not in a palace, not in some radiant hall of marble, but in a dark and damp place that smelled of stone and soil. His mother was Maia, a nymph, so shy that she rarely spoke, even to the other gods. She had taken refuge in the cave, avoiding the chaos of Olympus. This is where Hermes came into the world. According to the Homeric hymn to Hermes, something unusual happened almost immediately. Unlike most infants, Hermes did not spend his first day crying. He spent it plotting. Imagine that, a god, still wrapped in swaddling cloth, already restless. Before the day was done, he had slipped from the cradle and set his eyes on adventure. Instead, it became a story about theft. They are slow, heavy animals, trudging through fields and chewing endlessly. But in the ancient world, they were the measure of wealth. Cows provided milk, hides, meat, and labor. They were divine, glowing with a kind of mythic presence. They grazed near Pieria, a region north of Mount Olympus, watched carefully by Apollo's servants, that Hermes decided to take. What makes the story almost comical is the way Hermes went about it. He did not rush in with strength, like Heracles might. Instead, he turned to tricks. He reversed the hooves of the cows so that their tracks pointed in the wrong direction. He wore sandals made from branches to disguise his own footprints. It was elaborate, almost petty, in the level of detail. He was not just stealing, he was outsmarting. And remember, this was still the first day of his life. The hymn tells us that Hermes, still an infant, crept out of the cave while Maia slept. He moved quickly, as though he already knew the paths of the world. His small body carried him to Pieria, where the cows grazed. There, he drove them away, carefully reversing their hooves and leading them backward so that Apollo would not know where they had gone. The Greeks must have laughed at this story, but they also understood its meaning. Hermes was not a god of brute force, nor of law. He was the god of cunning, of the sideways glance, of the trick no one expected. Along the way, Hermes encountered an old man working in the fields. Instead of being afraid, Hermes simply threatened him, warning him not to tell anyone what he had seen, even as a baby. Hermes was a master of intimidation wrapped in charm. The old man kept quiet, and the cows continued forward. But Hermes did not simply steal the cows. On his way back, he did something even more unexpected. He stopped, killed one of the cattle, and offered its meat in a kind of makeshift sacrifice. From the entrails, he crafted something new, a lyre. The irony is sharp here. Hermes created something beautiful, but not for himself. The Greeks loved these little ironies. A story about cows became a story about music, about invention born from mischief. Of course, Apollo was not blind. He noticed quickly that his cows were missing. Their absence was not just an inconvenience, it was a violation. The god of prophecy, music, and order could not allow such chaos to go unanswered. The footprints did not make sense. The detail of reversed hooves is almost boring in its smallness, but that is the point. The Greeks wanted you to imagine Apollo bending down, scanning the dirt, confused by the petty genius of a baby god. Finally, Apollo found the old man who had seen Hermes. The man hesitated, clearly frightened. Apollo pressed him, but the old man could not give a clear answer. He was too afraid of Hermes' warning. Even the truth seemed tangled in trickery. Apollo eventually made his way to Maia's cave, where Hermes lay swaddled, pretending to be asleep. Imagine the scene: the radiant Apollo, tall and golden, stepping into the damp shadows of the cave, looking down at a baby. "Where are my cows?" he demanded. Hermes, opening his innocent eyes, denied everything. He was just a child, he insisted, incapable of such deeds. His voice was soft, almost mocking, as though he enjoyed the absurdity of it. He argued that he was too young even to know what a cow was, too young to walk, too young to steal. Apollo, of course, knew better, but the situation was so strange, so ridiculous, that even Apollo struggled to respond. The matter could not remain between brothers. Eventually, the dispute was taken before Zeus, the father of both gods. Hermes was carried to Olympus, still, wrapped like a child, and placed before the king of the gods. Zeus listened, his face unmoved. He had seen countless disputes before, many of them bloody and tragic. But this, a newborn, accused of cow theft, must have seemed almost refreshing. Apollo demanded justice. Hermes denied everything, smiling. All the while, Zeus, rather than punish, laughed. He saw in Hermes not just a thief, but a spark of something useful: cleverness, adaptability, a wit that could serve the gods in ways brute force could not. It was Zeus who ordered Hermes to return the cows, but he did so with amusement, not anger. And so, the first pattern of Hermes' life was set. He would always walk between truth and lies, between order and chaos. He would be the god of thieves and merchants, of travelers and messengers, of those who lived not by strength but by wit. But this first story was not finished yet, because even after being caught, Hermes was not truly punished. Instead, he found a way to twist the situation further, offering Apollo something that would change the relationship between them forever. You can almost hear the silence of that cave. Apollo, standing tall and angry. Hermes, tiny and smiling. Zeus, laughing softly in the background. The stolen cows grazing outside. It is not the kind of scene you expect from mythology. There is no grand battle, no thunderous climax, just a trick, a theft, and a question of what will come next. Because what Hermes offered Apollo was not just the return of the cows. He offered something else, something that would alter the balance between the brothers, between order and trickery, between music and theft. But what was it? And why would Apollo, the god of light and prophecy, accept such a gift from the trickster who had just humiliated him? Hermes had been caught. Apollo stood before Zeus, demanding justice. The infant thief still swaddled in cloth, eyes bright with mischief. The judgment seemed obvious. The cows must be returned and Apollo's honor restored. But Hermes was not finished. Even in the shadow of Zeus, the newborn trickster began weaving another plan. He had stolen cows, yes, but in the process, he had created something entirely new. A small instrument with a hollow shell, stretched strings, and a voice that no one had ever heard before. This was the lyre. When Hermes brought it forward, the gods watched with curiosity. It was not a weapon, not a token of power, not even a gift of wealth. It was something quieter, stranger, something that seemed useless in the grand struggles of Olympus. But Hermes sat up in his tiny form, plucked the strings, and let the sound carry. The notes rang out with a sweetness so unexpected that the gods leaned closer. Even Zeus, who had little patience for subtleties, tilted his head. The melody was new, unlike anything that had existed before, a sound that could tame anger or stir longing, a sound that made silence seem empty when it ended. Apollo, who had come with anger, paused. His cows were gone, his dignity had been mocked. But here was something that spoke to him in a different way. He was the god of prophecy, the god of order, and he had already been associated with music, though more through voice and song than through instruments. The lyre, with its delicate resonance, seemed to belong to him more than to the infant who had fashioned it. Hermes must have known this. He played not only for amusement, but to bait his brother into wanting the thing he had just created. The bargain, as it unfolded, was almost too perfect. Hermes agreed to give Apollo the lyre, offering it as a gesture of reconciliation. In return, Apollo would overlook the theft of the cows and instead grant Hermes recognition, not just as a mischievous child, but as one who had a place among the gods. It was a trade, music for forgiveness, trickery exchanged for legitimacy. From then on, Apollo would be forever linked with the lyre, carrying it as a symbol of his harmony and artistry. The irony lingered. Apollo's greatest emblem came from the very brother who had mocked him with theft. But Hermes was clever enough not to stop there. The cows, or at least most of them, were returned, though in fragments. Hermes had already sacrificed 2 of them, cutting them into portions, roasting the meat, and dividing the pieces with a ritual precision. In doing so, he performed one of the first acts of sacrifice, laying down a structure that mortals would later mimic in their own rituals. The Greeks saw this as another layer of significance. Hermes, while stealing, also gave structure to the relationship between gods and men. His crime had become a model for worship. Apollo grudgingly accepted what had been done, but Zeus did not let the moment pass without sealing it into fate. He appointed Hermes as messenger of the gods, granting him authority to travel between realms. It was an unusual appointment. Hermes was still a child, still too new to be trusted, yet Zeus had seen the potential in him. Cunning could be dangerous, but it could also be useful. Olympus needed a figure who could slip between places, who could carry secrets and bargains, who could lie when necessary and charm when lies were too obvious. Hermes became that figure. In this way, the theft of cows had created an entirely new order among the gods. Apollo, with his dignity restored and his lyre in hand, embodied music and prophecy more completely than before. Hermes, with his trickery acknowledged rather than punished, became a god in his own right, not as a warrior or a ruler, but as the embodiment of cleverness, theft, and communication. What began as a petty crime turned into a reshaping of divine identity. Still, The Greeks never told this story as though it were a grand event. They relished the absurdity. A baby stealing cattle, reversing their hooves, and lying to Apollo with a straight face. The comedy of it remained part of the lesson. Power was not always about strength or justice. Sometimes it was about wit, the kind of wit that could humiliate even a god of order. To the Greeks, this was a reminder that cleverness often wins, where brute force cannot. But what is most striking is the role of music in this story. The lyre became more than just a symbol of Apollo, became a symbol of how conflict could turn into creation. One brother tricked the other, but instead of endless feud, the outcome was harmony. Music replaced anger, song replaced vengeance. It is as though the Greeks were suggesting that even in chaos, something new and beautiful can emerge, a kind of accidental progress born from dishonesty. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, why did Zeus laugh instead of scold? Why was Hermes rewarded rather than punished? Perhaps the gods, like men, recognized that mischief has a place in the world, that order without cunning becomes brittle, too rigid to last. Zeus may have seen in Hermes not just a troublesome child, but a necessary force, a reminder that rules are only strong if there are those clever enough to bend them. The story ends here. In Section 2, not with a final resolution, but with a balance that feels uneasy. Hermes has gained his role. Apollo has gained his instrument. Zeus has gained a messenger, but the trickster has also gained something more. He has proven that deception itself can create order, that theft can give birth to tradition, that lies can be woven into the fabric of truth. And this leaves us with a question. If a god could lie, steal, and cheat his way into honor, what did that mean for mortals who lived under the shadow of these same gods? Were they meant to follow rules, or to bend them? Was the lesson obedience, or was the lesson cleverness? The story of Hermes stealing Apollo's cows does not end with the exchange of the lyre. That was only the beginning, a kind of origin myth for the trickster god. From this single act, Hermes' entire character took shape, and the Greeks came to understand him not as a side figure, but as one of the most essential presences in their world. He was the one who moved between boundaries, the one who blurred the lines between truth and falsehood, between gods and mortals, between the living and the dead. After Zeus appointed him as the divine messenger, Hermes was never truly tied down to one place. He wore winged sandals that carried him across the earth, across the sea, even down into the underworld. This freedom was part of his gift. He was not trapped in Olympus, like some of the others, bound to thrones and responsibilities. Instead, he was everywhere, slipping into markets, roads, fields, and ships. For mortals, this made him a familiar figure. Unlike Zeus or Apollo, who felt distant and untouchable, Hermes could almost be imagined as walking past you on the road, perhaps smiling, perhaps watching for what he could take. The Greeks, pragmatic as always, tied Hermes to the ordinary details of life. He became the god of merchants, the one who oversaw trade and exchange. Every coin, every bargain, every purchase carried a whisper of his cleverness. He was also the god of thieves, a recognition that commerce and crime often live side by side. To honor Hermes was to admit that even in theft there was a kind of divine order, a pattern too persistent to ignore. He was the god of travelers, as well, guiding them along roads that cut through mountains and valleys, roads that were dangerous and uncertain. Shrines to Hermes stood at crossroads, simple stone markers called Hermes, often just pillars with carved heads, reminders that even in the dull monotony of a long journey, a god was present. This connection to travel and exchange made Hermes deeply practical, but it also made him unsettling. He was not a god of stability. He was a god of movement, of uncertainty, of bargains struck in the shadows. Farmers prayed to him to protect their goods, but thieves prayed to him as well for luck in stealing them. Merchants hoped he would bless their trade, but smugglers hoped for the same blessing. He was a god who belonged to both sides of the line, and yet, beyond the roads and markets, Hermes had another role. He was the psychopomp, the guide of souls. When mortals died, it was Hermes who led them to the underworld. Not Hades, not Persephone, not some dark and terrifying spirit, but Hermes, the same god who once reversed the hooves of cows to cover his tracks. The Greeks saw something comforting in this. Death was frightening, but if Hermes was the one who took your hand, then perhaps it was less lonely. He was not cruel, not harsh, but calm, swift, and always moving. The same wit that tricked Apollo into accepting a stolen herd was now used to guide souls through the most uncertain journey of all. The importance of this role cannot be overstated. The Greeks lived with death constantly. Plague and accident were part of ordinary life. To imagine Hermes walking with you after death, leading you safely to the halls of Hades, was not just myth, it was reassurance. The trickster was not only a thief, he was also a companion in the moment when companionship mattered most. All of this flowed from that first day of his life, from the stolen cows and the invention of music. The Greeks told and retold this story, not because it was grand, but because it revealed the strange truth that even the gods were shaped by small, ordinary details. A herd of cattle, a tortoiseshell, an argument between brothers. These were not the stuff of great wars or cosmic battles, but they were enough to define a god. In the end, Hermes' theft was remembered not as a crime, but as a foundation. Apollo gained his lyre, Zeus gained a messenger, and mortals gained a god who lived in their daily lives, in their money, their travel, their trade, their thefts, and even their deaths. Hermes was never majestic in the way that Zeus was, nor radiant like Apollo, nor fierce like Ares. He was clever, ordinary, quick, and necessary. The Greeks could not live without him, because life itself was never only about order and glory. Life was also about cunning, about bending the rules, about surviving with wit when strength was not enough. So when you hear the story of Hermes stealing Apollo's cows, it is easy to laugh at the absurdity of it. A newborn crawling out of his cradle to herd glowing cattle backward across the fields is not the picture of divine majesty. But in that absurdity lies the truth the Greeks knew well. The gods were not distant forces beyond comprehension. They were reflections of the world's smallest and strangest details. A reversed hoofprint in the dirt, a lie told with a smile, a tune plucked on a tortoiseshell. And perhaps this is why the story lingers. Because even today, we understand that much of life is not decided by the powerful gestures, but by the small tricks, the clever words, the sideways glance. Hermes reminds us that wit can be divine, that mischief can shape destiny, and that even in the most ordinary theft, lies the seed of something enduring, but it leaves us with a thought that is not so easy to answer. If a God could steal, lie, and trick his way into becoming essential, what does that mean for us? Are we meant to follow rules, or to bend them when the world demands it? Is cleverness a crime, or is it the hidden order that keeps everything moving? The Tigris and the Euphrates. The land is dusty, the heat pressing down, and the water that trickles through canals is the lifeblood of an entire civilization. This is Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization, where people learned the art of farming, irrigation, and settlement. And in this land of mud and grain, something else was born, something quieter, but perhaps even more important than temples and kings: bureaucracy. Not the kind of bureaucracy you might picture today, with paper forms and long lines, but its ancestor carved into wet clay with a sharp stylus. It is strange to think that one of the most powerful inventions in human history began with farmers worrying about grain. For the Sumerians, food was everything. Too much rain and the fields flooded, too little and famine crept in. Irrigation had to be organized, harvests counted, and surpluses stored. No king could keep track of it all with memory alone. No priest could bless away the confusion of numbers. So they began to record, at first with tokens and marks, then with writing. Not for poetry, not for myths, not for grand stories, but for lists. Lists of grain, lists of sheep, lists of workers. Boring, perhaps, but essential. You can picture the scene. A scribe sits in a dim room, the air cool from thick mud brick walls. In front of him, a small tablet of wet clay, soft enough to press into. In his hand, a stylus, maybe made of reed. He leans forward, carefully pressing wedge-shaped marks into the surface. One mark for 10 sheep, another for a sack of barley. Line after line, he fills the tablet with numbers and names, the most ordinary details of life. When he finishes, the tablet is left to dry in the sun. Hard, durable, it becomes a permanent record. The scribe may forget, the farmer may die, but the tablet remains. The earliest tablets we have are exactly this: receipts, a record that someone brought 5 jars of oil, a note that a certain household owed 3 goats. They are dull to read, but they are the foundation of civilization. With these records, temples could manage surplus, cities could plan for droughts, and kings could tax their people. Without them, there would only have been chaos, each person hoarding what they could, each memory unreliable. Clay tablets gave order where otherwise there would have been confusion. The bureaucrats of Mesopotamia were not warriors or poets, but they held enormous power. They knew who owed what, who had delivered their share, and who was falling behind. Their control was not through weapons, but through knowledge. If your debt was carved into clay, there was no arguing with it. The gods themselves might be distant, but the tablet in the hands of a scribe was immediate and undeniable. Bureaucracy, in this way, became almost divine, a force that dictated the rhythm of life. And yet, for all its power, it must have been boring work. Imagine spending your days carving numbers and names, one after another, the clay drying under your hands as you repeated the same symbols endlessly. Most scribes were trained from childhood, memorizing signs, practicing on broken shards of pottery, until their hands knew the motions by instinct. Theirs was not the glory of generals, but the quiet authority of record keepers. Without them, kings would have had no armies, priests, no temples, merchants, no trade. The tablets themselves speak. Across the centuries, some are simple and brief, others dense with information. Many survive not because they were treasured, but because they were thrown away, discarded into heaps that hardened over time. Archaeologists dig them up now and find the daily details of lives long gone, deliveries of beer, rations for workers, shipments of wool. Reading them is like reading the invoices of a world 4,000 years old. It might seem dull, but within these lists is the story of how humans learned to organize themselves. To create a city, you need walls, water, and food. But to sustain a city, you need records. Without the tablets, the city would collapse under the weight of confusion. The dull marks in clay were as important as bricks or swords. The Greeks told stories of gods and heroes, but the Sumerians left us receipts, and in those receipts we see the first outlines of the modern world. Laws, taxes, wages, contracts, they all grow from those clay marks. Bureaucracy, though tedious, is one of humanity's greatest inventions, because it allowed large groups of people to live together in some form of order. But there is something curious here. The first writing was not born from the desire to tell stories, but from the need to count. And yet, later, writing would give us epics like Gilgamesh, hymns to the gods, myths that carried culture forward. How did the act of recording numbers evolve into the act of recording stories? How did bureaucracy give birth to literature? The clay tablets that began as lists of grain and sheep soon grew into something more complicated. At first, they were simple receipts, marks to prove a delivery had been made or a debt was owed. But the more people relied on them, the more these tablets began to shape the very rules of society. What started as counting turned into law. A contract scratched into clay was not just a reminder. It was a promise given weight by permanence. A man might swear an oath, but an oath faded on the air. A tablet endured in the cities of Mesopotamia. Bureaucracy crept into every part of life. If you borrowed silver, it was recorded. If you sold land, it was recorded. If you married, the terms of your marriage could be written down as well. Clay did not bend to memory. It demanded precision. A scribe carved exactly what was agreed, and once dried, it could not easily be changed. Disputes could then be settled, not by shouting or violence, but by pointing to a tablet. The dull surface of baked mud became the arbiter of truth. This gave rise to something extraordinary: legal codes. The most famous is the Code of Hammurabi, carved not just into tablets, but into a great stone stele, its laws visible to all. Yet, even before Hammurabi, smaller codes existed, tablets that outlined rules for trade, punishment, and family life. They may read to us as rigid or even cruel, but for their time they represented a great shift. No longer were rules passed only through custom or word of mouth. They were written, fixed, and could not easily be denied. Bureaucracy had become justice. Imagine the scene of a marketplace in Babylon. Merchants call out their wares: barley, dates, wool, bronze, tools. A man buys a measure of barley, and instead of relying on memory, a scribe notes the exchange. The buyer cannot later claim he bought less, nor can the seller pretend he was cheated. The clay tablet speaks for both. In this way, bureaucracy allowed strangers to do business without trust. Trust was replaced by record. It is a small shift, but it is the foundation of trade. Without such records, commerce could not grow beyond small villages. With them, goods could flow between cities, even across regions, because the records preserved obligation. But bureaucracy was not only for merchants, it shaped families as well. Marriage contracts specified the duties of husband and wife, and what would happen if one abandoned the other. Adoption contracts recorded who would inherit property. Wills left instructions for children. These details may sound mundane, but they show how clay tablets extended into the intimate parts of life. The law was not just for kings and priests. It was for ordinary people, their marriages, their debts, their disputes. Scribes were at the center of it all. Their training was long, their status respected. A boy destined to be a scribe spent years copying signs, filling practice tablets with lists and phrases. Schools for scribes left behind tablets filled with repeated again and again, students writing the same sentence until the shapes became automatic. Their handwriting was not for art, but for accuracy, their skill a tool of power. Few people could read or write, which meant the scribes were the gatekeepers of bureaucracy. To control writing was to control memory, and to control memory was to control law. Sometimes the tablets even preserved the voices of the scribes themselves. Complaints about students who were lazy, notes about missed payments, instructions on how to properly measure a field. In their dryness, these small records show the humanity behind the bureaucracy. These were not faceless officials, but men with ink-stained fingers, tired eyes, and the quiet pride of knowing that what they wrote could outlast them as the centuries passed. The scope of bureaucracy widened. Kings used tablets to list the rations for their soldiers, to count the tribute from conquered lands, to organize workers, building temples and canals. Every loaf of bread given to a laborer could be recorded, every jug of beer accounted for. The records pile up in our imagination, endless stacks of clay, each one marked with wedge-shaped symbols that speak of bread, oil, sheep, or silver. None of it seems heroic, yet without it, empires could not stand. The monuments of Mesopotamia, the ziggurats rising toward the sky, were not built by inspiration alone. They were built by labor, carefully measured, fed, and tracked on tablets. It is easy to forget how fragile memory is. Without writing, promises vanish, debts are disputed, and rulers forget the extent of their lands. With writing, even a simple delivery of onions could be preserved for 4,000 years. And from these ordinary details emerged something profound. The law was no longer the whim of the strong, but the inscription of the tablet. The marketplace was no longer a place of haggling alone, but of contracts. The family was no longer just custom and tradition, but also written expectation. Bureaucracy bound life together in ways invisible but powerful. And yet, there is a tension here. Writing began as a tool for bureaucracy, but once invented, it could not be confined. The same wedge-shaped marks that recorded sheep could also record prayers. The same stylus that carved contracts could carve myths. From bureaucracy came literature, though at first the bureaucrats may not have realized what they had unleashed. What began as dull lists became, over centuries, the foundation of stories, hymns, and poetry. From clay tablets of grain came the Epic of Gilgamesh. But what does it mean that the first stories of humanity grew out of receipts? What does it mean that the oldest myths were written with the same hand that tallied beer rations? Clay tablets began as marks of grain and oil, then expanded into contracts and laws. But their influence did not stop at the marketplace or the court. Once the tool existed, people discovered that it could serve purposes far beyond bureaucracy. A stylus pressed into clay could not only bind agreements, but also capture prayers, myths, and stories. What had begun as an invention to solve the problem of memory grew into the first written literature. Some of the earliest hymns we know are preserved on tablets from Mesopotamia. They are simple, repetitive invocations to the gods, the kind of words that might once have been spoken aloud in temple rituals. Writing them down fixed them, gave them permanence, and allowed them to be repeated with consistency. Priests no longer had to trust memory alone. The god received the same words, the same rhythm, the same offering, day after day. Bureaucracy had made its way into worship, turning even the act of prayer into something ordered and standardized. From these hymns came myths. The Sumerians and later the Babylonians wrote stories of gods and heroes, of Enlil, Inanna, Marduk, and others. The most famous of these is the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale of kingship, friendship, and mortality. But it is striking to remember that the very same script that told of Gilgamesh's battles and his grief was also used to record deliveries of wheat. The sublime and the mundane existed side by side on the same medium. A tablet preserved a receipt for sheep might the next day hold a hymn to a goddess. The division we often imagine between art and administration did not exist. Writing was all-encompassing, and bureaucracy was the path by which it spread. The impact of this transformation was immense. Once myths and laws could be written, they could be shared. A king could ensure that his decrees were carried intact from one city to another. A temple could standardize its rituals across generations. Families could keep track of lineages, ensuring inheritance did not fall into dispute. Writing tied the present to the past, binding memory not to fragile human recall, but to durable clay. This durability gave civilizations something they had never had before: continuity. Archaeologists, digging through the ruins of Mesopotamian cities, often find thousands of tablets, stacked or scattered, many of them broken, many incomplete, too. Look at them is to look at the fossilized memory of a people. One tablet might describe a temple donation, another a dispute over land, another a dream interpreted as an omen. Together, they show a society that used writing not for entertainment, but for survival, weaving order into the chaos of life. It is telling that later civilizations, including the Greeks and Romans, would inherit this practice. Though their alphabets differed, the idea remained. Writing preserves order. Writing extends power. Writing makes memory permanent. And always at the heart of it lies bureaucracy, dull in its details, but immense in its effect. Without lists, contracts, and records, there could be no epic poems, no organized religion, no enduring law. Yet there is also irony. We look back on Mesopotamia and remember its myths, its gods, its Epic of Gilgamesh. But the scribes who created the system did not set out to write poetry. They set out to count sheep. The beauty of human history is that so much of what we treasure begins in necessity, in boredom, in the dull grind of accounting. Bureaucracy, in all its monotony, gave us literature, law, and continuity. And so, when we picture a scribe leaning over his clay tablet, carefully pressing wedge after wedge into the damp surface, it is worth pausing. His work may have seemed tedious, but in those marks lay the shape of civilization itself. He was not only recording, he was inventing the possibility of permanence. Still, one question lingers. If writing began as a tool of bureaucracy, meant only to preserve lists and receipts, does that mean all of our great stories even today are still tied to the same impulse? Are the epics and novels, the poems and histories, nothing more than elaborate records, attempts to account for what has been and what might come? The Romans were famous for their roads, their armies, and their conquests, but perhaps nothing shaped daily life more than water. Not water in the abstract sense of seas or rivers, but water as it trickled into kitchens, baths, fountains, and fields. Rome was a city that should not have survived as it grew. Its natural springs were not enough for the swelling population, and wells could not supply what hundreds of thousands of people demanded. The answer was a system that seems dull in its design, but brilliant in its persistence. Aqueducts. Imagine the Roman countryside 2,000 years ago. Hills, valleys, stone villages, and beyond them the faint outline of arches stretching across the horizon. To the casual eye they might have seemed like walls or bridges, but they carried something invisible. A thin stream of water, moving day and night from distant springs into the heart of the city. The aqueducts were not built for glory. They were built so that people could drink, bathe, and survive. Yet in their quietness they became symbols of Rome's endurance. The first Roman aqueduct, the Aqua Appia, was begun in 312 BCE. It did not look impressive on the surface. Most of it ran underground, hidden from sight, a channel cut through stone and sealed with lime. Its purpose was simple: to bring water from a source miles away into the city. Nothing dramatic, no ceremonies or myths, just a slow, steady flow. But once it existed, the city began to change. For the first time, water could be relied upon, not as a luxury, but as a constant. Fountains bubbled, public baths filled, and households found relief in knowing the supply did not vanish with a drought. The Romans expanded this system relentlessly. By the height of the empire, Rome was fed by 11 aqueducts stretching hundreds of miles. Some were grand, crossing valleys on massive arcades of stone, their arches lined up with mathematical precision. Others remained hidden beneath the ground, quiet tunnels carrying streams through darkness. Together, they provided the city with enough water for baths, fountains, sewers, and even artificial lakes used for entertainment. The sheer scale of it is staggering, yet the Romans themselves treated it as ordinary, part of the background of life, and that ordinariness is what makes it fascinating. Imagine waking up in a Roman insula, a crowded apartment block. You descend the stairs, carrying a clay jug. In the street below, water spills from a public fountain, fed by the aqueduct system. You dip your jug, fill it, and carry it back upstairs. You do not think of the hills the water has crossed, the arches that stand in the countryside, the engineers who surveyed the land with measuring rods. You only think that water is there, as it always is. The infrastructure disappears into habit. The work behind it was anything but simple. Roman engineers had to survey long distances, often bringing water from sources many miles away. They relied on gravity, ensuring a gentle, continuous slope to steep, and the water rushed dangerously to flat, and it stalled. The precision required was immense, yet they achieved it with simple tools: groma for surveying, chorobates for measuring levels, rods and plumb lines to guide their sight. They cut through hills with tunnels, spanned valleys with arches, and laid channels lined with waterproof cement. Each detail was practical, almost boring in its repetition. But the result was extraordinary. Archaeologists have studied the channels and found signs of repair. Lime deposits were scraped away, cracks patched, sections rebuilt. The aqueducts required constant maintenance, and teams of workers, called equerri, were assigned to inspect and clean them. They carried tools for scraping and sealing, moving from one section to the next. Their work was not glorious, but it kept the lifeblood of the city moving. Without them, the water stopped, and with it, life in Rome would have faltered. The aqueducts also reveal something about Roman society itself. Access to water was not equal. The wealthy could have water piped directly into their villas, their fountains bubbling in courtyards, their baths filled without effort. The poor carried water from public fountains, waiting their turn in crowded streets. Bathhouses, however, were open to all, supplied generously with water that poured through heated chambers and great pools. In these shared spaces, rich and poor alike felt the presence of Rome's hydraulic system. The water, while unevenly distributed, still bound the city together in daily ritual. As Rome grew, water also became entertainment. Emperors filled artificial lakes for naval battles, flooded arenas for spectacle, and supplied extravagant fountains that sprayed in public squares. The aqueducts made this possible. They gave rulers a tool for generosity, a way to display power not only through armies, but through abundance. To offer free water was to show control of nature, to remind the people that Rome bent rivers to its will. Yet, for all their grandeur, the aqueducts were also fragile. They could be cut by enemies, damaged by earthquakes, or simply fall into disrepair if neglected. Rome's dependence on them made the city vulnerable. Later writers would recall times when aqueducts were broken and the fountains ran dry, and how quickly daily life descended into chaos. The system that seemed so constant was, in truth, delicate, always in need of care. And so, in the arches that still stand today, half ruined across the Italian countryside, we see not just engineering, but persistence. These stones were not placed for beauty, though they became beautiful, water flowing silently through channels, shaping the rhythm of a city. But this leads to a question. Was the success of Rome really built on its armies and conquests, or was it built on the quiet, constant work of its engineers, ensuring water flowed each morning into fountains and baths? Water in Rome was more than a necessity. Emperors understood this better than most. A general could win battles and secure borders, but to bring water to the people every day won loyalty in a quieter, more enduring way. Free grain might fill the stomach, but flowing water filled both the body and the imagination. By the late Republic and early Empire, aqueducts had become political instruments. Leaders funded new ones to win favor, their names carved on inscriptions along the channels. An emperor who restored or extended an aqueduct was praised as a benefactor, even as a savior of the city. Augustus, for example, boasted of restoring aqueducts that had fallen into disrepair. Claudius built the Aqua Claudia and Anno Novus, bringing immense volumes of water into Rome. These projects were not just engineering feats, but public declarations. The emperor cares for you. The emperor provides. Ordinary Romans felt this power in subtle ways. Every time they stepped into a public bath, they were reminded of imperial generosity. Bathhouses were not only places for washing, but for socializing, exercising, conducting business, and gossiping. They were the beating heart of urban life, and without aqueducts, they could not exist. The water was heated through massive furnaces, circulated into hot pools, tepid pools, cold pools, and steam rooms. To bathe was to participate in Rome itself, to share in the order and abundance made possible by the empire's reach. Fountains, too, spoke of this abundance. Many were modest basins in neighborhoods, serving the practical needs of families who came to fill jugs. They were public. Art as much as infrastructure, reminders that Rome had both the resources and the will to make beauty flow through its streets. These fountains gushed not for profit, but as gifts, their continuous flow symbolizing the continuity of Rome itself. Yet, beneath this generosity was strict control. Access to aqueduct water was regulated by officials called curators aquarum. They monitored usage, ensured repairs, and guarded against illegal taps. For though water seemed free, private individuals often bribed workers or cut secret pipes into channels to bring water into their own gardens and estates. This was theft, but it was also a mark of privilege. Wealthy households flaunted water features, small fountains trickling in courtyards, pools reflecting marble columns. These private luxuries were made possible by bending rules or exerting influence. Even in water, Rome reflected its social inequalities. Maintenance, too, was political. The aqueducts required constant inspection, cleaning, and repair. Lime deposits built up inside channels, narrowing the flow. Teams of workers labored continually, scraping, patching, replacing. If an aqueduct failed, blame could fall on those responsible, and so its upkeep was tied to reputation and stability. To neglect water was to risk unrest. For ordinary Romans, the aqueducts were invisible when they worked, but their failure was immediately noticed. A dry fountain or empty bathhouse meant disruption, and disruption could turn to anger. Beyond the city itself, aqueducts reshaped the countryside. They carved new lines into the landscape, arches crossing valleys, tunnels cut through hills, bridges spanning ravines. Farmers watched as these structures appeared near their fields, carrying water not for crops but for distant Rome. It was a reminder of the hierarchy of empire. The needs of the city outweighed the needs of the countryside. At times, local disputes arose when villages saw their streams diverted, but the authority of Rome prevailed. The city was the heart, and the aqueducts were its arteries, drawing lifeblood from afar. In this way, aqueducts became symbols, not just of engineering skill, but of Roman order itself. They showed that the empire could harness resources across vast distances, organize labor, and sustain urban life on a scale no earlier civilization had managed. Each drop of water that spilled into a fountain carried with it the weight of administration, surveying, construction, and maintenance. To live in Rome was to live inside a system as invisible as it was powerful, one that defined daily habits without fanfare, and yet there is something almost ironic in how ordinary the result felt to those who benefited. Children splashed in fountains without thinking of the mountains miles away. Bathers sank into warm pools without considering the tunnels and arches that had carried the water. Housewives filled jugs, cooks boiled vegetables, gardeners watered plants, all unaware of the layers of work behind every drop. The aqueducts had become so reliable, so constant, that they vanished into background noise. Still, the Romans themselves were not entirely blind to their importance. Writers like Frontinus, who served as water commissioner in the 1st century CE, left detailed accounts of the aqueducts, their flow rates, their lengths, and their upkeep. His work reads like a manual, precise and dry, but behind the numbers lies an appreciation for the system as a whole. He understood that without water, Rome would falter, and he treated the aqueducts not as curiosities but as lifelines, which leaves us with a thought. Was Rome's greatness defined by its battles and conquests? Or was it defined by the quiet, unnoticed systems that sustained daily life? The aqueducts remind us that the survival of a city depends not only on victories, but on the slow, constant work of infrastructure. But then another question lingers. If Rome's power rested so heavily on water, what happened when that flow was interrupted? What happened when the system, so carefully built and maintained, began to fail? When we think of the Roman aqueducts today, we see them mostly in fragments, broken arches rising from fields, half-buried channels stretching into the distance, stonework crumbling against the sky. It is easy to imagine them as ruins of grandeur, monuments to an empire that once commanded the world. But for the Romans themselves, these structures were not monuments at all. They were practical, everyday tools meant to deliver water quietly and without interruption. The collapse of the aqueducts did not happen all at once, with a single dramatic moment. It happened slowly, almost invisibly, as the empire itself weakened. The system relied on constant maintenance, on workers who scraped lime from channels, patched cracks, and replaced broken sections. As long as Rome was strong, there were funds and organization to keep this work going. But when the empire stretched too far, when wars drained resources, when leadership faltered, the steady hum of maintenance began to falter too. A small crack left untended grew larger. A section damaged by flood was left unrepaired. An aqueduct that once carried fresh water dwindled to a trickle. For a city that had come to expect abundance, the absence must have felt sudden, even if it was the result of years of neglect. There were also enemies. Invading armies sometimes cut aqueducts deliberately, knowing that to deprive a city of water was to strike at its very heart. During sieges, channels were blocked or destroyed. Rome was proud of its walls, its defenses, but the aqueducts stretched beyond those defenses, exposed in the countryside, vulnerable to disruption. A wall could stop soldiers. It could not stop thirst by the time the Western Roman Empire fell. In the 5th century, many aqueducts were already in disrepair. Some continued to function, patched by local authorities or even by private households, but But the grand system that had once fed Rome's fountains and baths no longer operated as it once had. Public baths fell silent. Fountains dried. What had been ordinary for centuries, the expectation that water flowed freely into the city, was no longer guaranteed. Daily life adjusted to scarcity, and with that adjustment, a way of life ended. Yet not all was lost. Some aqueducts survived, cared for by later rulers, adapted into new systems, or simply too well built to vanish entirely. In the Middle Ages, certain sections still carried water, serving smaller populations, and even in ruin, they inspired. Travelers looked at the long lines of arches and marveled at what the ancients had achieved. The ruins became monuments, not of everyday life, but of forgotten greatness. The practical had become poetic, the ordinary transformed into a symbol of lost order. Today, the remains of Roman aqueducts still stand across Europe and the Mediterranean. Tourists walk beneath their arches, taking photographs, reading plaques. Engineers study them, noting the precision of their gradients, the durability of their stonework, the ingenuity of their design. They are admired as relics of genius, yet their true genius lay not in being grand, but in being ordinary. They worked quietly, without spectacle, for centuries, turning the chaos of urban life into something sustainable. They were boring, repetitive, endlessly maintained, and that is precisely why they mattered. In this way, the aqueducts mirror Rome itself. The empire is remembered for its conquests, its gladiators, its emperors, but its survival depended on quieter forces, grain shipments, tax records, water supplies. Glory may have filled the stories, but bureaucracy and infrastructure filled the days. The aqueducts are reminders that civilizations rise not only through strength, but through the dull but essential work of keeping life flowing. And so, when you picture a Roman aqueduct, imagine not only the ruin, but the rhythm, the slow, steady trickle of water, moving mile after mile, flowing into fountains where children laughed, into baths where men argued about politics, into kitchens where bread was baked. The arches stood not for spectacle, but for continuity. Their stones carried not just water, but time itself. Still, one question remains as we leave the story of Roman aqueducts behind. If civilizations depend so heavily on the boring systems that sustain them, what happens to us if those systems fail? Do we notice them only in their absence, as Rome did when its fountains fell silent? Or are we, like the Romans once were, already living inside fragile systems we assume will last forever? Imagine China in the 7th century, during the height of the Tang dynasty. The empire stretches vast and wide, from bustling cities filled with markets and temples to distant borderlands, where soldiers guard mountain passes. Holding such a realm together was not only a matter of armies or taxes, but of something quieter, communication. Messages had to travel, orders had to be given, reports had to return. And so the Temps perfected a postal system that may sound mundane to us now, yet it was one of the lifelines of their world. The Temps inherited earlier systems of couriers and messengers, but they expanded them into something remarkable for their time. Across the empire, stations were established, each placed a day's ride from the next. Horses were kept ready, fodder stocked, clerks trained to handle the flow of letters and packages. These stations were known as relay posts, and they formed a network that stretched for thousands of miles, binding the empire together. From the capital of Chang'an, dispatches could travel west along the Silk Road or south toward rice fields and river towns. The journey was not swift by our standards, but it was steady. A letter might take weeks or months, but it would reach its destination. The system was not for ordinary people. It was meant for officials, for governors, for generals in distant provinces. The emperor expected reports, and reports demanded a reliable path. At each station, a messenger could exchange his tired horse for a fresh one, continuing without pause. Clerks logged arrivals and departures, ensuring that no dispatch disappeared without record. The system was bureaucracy applied to distance, an attempt to make the vast empire feel connected despite its immensity. Imagine a dusty road stretching through open fields. A rider approaches, cloak drawn against the wind, his satchel heavy with dispatches. At the relay station, he dismounts, hands over his horse, and without much conversation is given another. Perhaps he eats a quick meal of millet, or drinks a cup of hot tea, then mounts again and continues. The rhythm is repetitive, unremarkable, but it is this very repetition that made the system function. Every rider, every clerk, every horse contributed to the quiet heartbeat of the empire. The messages themselves varied. Some were urgent reports of border skirmishes, others detailed accounts of harvests or tax collections. Some carried orders from the court: who was to be promoted, who was to be recalled, what tribute was expected from a province. To read them today would seem dull. Long lists of numbers and instructions, but for the temps, they were the nervous system of the state. Without them, governors would act without guidance, soldiers without command, farmers without oversight. The letters were threads, and without the threads, the fabric of empire would fray. The post system also linked China to the outside world. Envoys from Korea, Japan, Persia, and beyond traveled the same roads, carrying their own letters and gifts. Along the Silk Road, merchants sometimes relied on the relay posts for shelter, even if the system was not built for them. The presence of these stations meant that communication and trade could overlap. The bureaucracy of the tanks shaping the flow of goods as much as the flow of words. For the clerks who worked at these stations, life was repetitive. They rose early, checked supplies of fodder and grain, recorded the number of horses, prepared fresh mounts, and noted every arrival. They saw countless riders pass, but rarely knew the content of the messages they carried. Their role was essential, yet invisible, like the aqueduct workers of Rome or the scribes of Mesopotamia. Without them, nothing moved, yet their names were seldom remembered, and always there was time. The time it took for a letter to cross a province, the time it took for news from a distant border to reach Chang'an. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. A victory might be celebrated in the capital long after it had already been fought. A rebellion might be reported only after it had grown too large to contain. The slowness of communication shaped politics itself, forcing rulers to plan ahead, to trust governors with more autonomy, to accept that decisions were often made on outdated information. The Tang Dynasty post system reminds us that history is not only about battles and rulers, but about the ordinary flow of messages, the steady plod of hooves across dusty roads. It was boring in its rhythm, yet within that boredom lay the secret of stability. The empire endured because it could communicate. even slowly, even imperfectly. But this raises a question. If messages took months to arrive, how did rulers truly govern such a vast land? Was the empire ruled from the capital, or was it really held together by the endless work of clerks and couriers whose names we have forgotten? The postal system of the Temps was more than a network of riders and stations. It was a tool of governance. Through it, the emperor extended his reach far beyond the walls of Chang'an, across mountains, rivers, and deserts. Orders written in the capital might take weeks to arrive in a distant province, but when they did, they carried the weight of imperial authority. Governors could not claim ignorance, generals could not act freely for long, and even distant officials felt the shadow of the court through the sealed dispatches they received. The system, though slow, was a constant reminder that the emperor's word stretched across the empire. The slowness itself shaped how power functioned. A governor on the frontier might send a report of unrest, only to wait months for a reply. In the meantime, he had to act. Autonomy was unavoidable. The empire was governed not by instant commands, but by trust and delay, by officials who balanced local realities against the distant authority of the capital. Some abused this power, inflating their own strength or hiding failures, but the system still bound them. The expectation of a letter's arrival and the knowledge that one's actions would eventually be recorded created a discipline stronger than fear alone. At each station, the bureaucracy recorded details: the time of departure, the identity of the rider, the number of horses exchanged. Every step was logged, every movement entered into memory. If a dispatch went missing, there was a record of where it had last been seen. If a delay occurred, it could be traced back through the notes of clerks. This careful logging may sound dull, but it was what made the empire manageable. The Temps ruled not only through armies and taxes, but through paperwork pressed into the hands of couriers. For the riders themselves, the work was demanding. They endured long hours on horseback, harsh weather, lonely stretches of road. The pay was modest, the recognition slight, yet their labor was indispensable. Without them, the system broke. Some were veterans of the army, accustomed to endurance. Others were common men pressed into service. Few are remembered by name, though thousands must have passed through the system during the centuries of the Temps. Their anonymity is part of the story. They were not meant to be heroes, but to be reliable. Letters themselves carried different tones. Some were clipped orders, sealed with the mark of an official. Others were lengthy reports filled with numbers: how much grain was collected, how many soldiers stood ready, how many taxes had been paid. A few were personal, though not for ordinary people. High-ranking officials sometimes sent private notes through the system, blending business with friendship or family. These messages remind us that behind the bureaucracy were human lives, anxieties, and affections. Even in the most rigid system, people found ways to insert their own voices. The political weight of the postal system was immense. It made rebellion harder, though not impossible. A rebellious governor could cut off communication, but the absence of letters itself was suspicious. Silence spoke loudly in a system built on constant messages. Delays, gaps, or interruptions carried their own meaning, and the court often interpreted them as signs of disobedience. Thus, the system not only transmitted information, but also revealed when something was wrong. it also tied the empire's peripheries to its heart. A garrison in the far west, near the deserts of Central Asia, might feel isolated, surrounded by foreign tribes and endless sand. But the arrival of a courier from Chang'an, carrying a fresh seal of imperial authority, reminded them they were part of something larger. The psychological weight of connection mattered as much as the practical one. Even if the letter took months, the fact that it came at all bound distant places to the center. Meanwhile, the daily lives of the clerks and attendants at relay stations went on in monotonous cycles. They checked supplies of grain, watered horses, swept courtyards, and copied records. Travelers sometimes described these stations as plain, functional buildings, mud walls, wooden gates, a few rooms with mats for rest. Yet in their simplicity lay endurance. Each station was a small node in a network that, when combined, held the empire together. To live at a post was not glorious, but it was to stand at the edge of history, to touch the flow of words that moved between emperors and their subjects. The Tang dynasty is remembered for its poetry, its art, its trade along the Silk Road. Yet behind all of this was the quiet hum of bureaucracy. Letters moving, horses exchanged, clerks recording. Without the post, poems could not circulate, trade could not be coordinated, armies could not be commanded. The empire's culture and power depended on the slow, steady march of couriers across dusty roads. But this leads to another question. If governance relied on letters that took months to arrive, how did the temps maintain such stability? Was it discipline, bureaucracy, or simply the acceptance that delay was inevitable in an empire so large? The Tang postal system endured for centuries, but like all great structures of order, it was fragile beneath its surface. It relied on constant labor horses, fed, couriers ready, stations maintained. When the empire was strong, resources flowed, and the system functioned. But when war, rebellion, or famine disrupted supply, the steady rhythm of the posts faltered. A relay station without fodder could not provide fresh horses. A courier without pay might vanish, taking his satchel with him. The system's strength lay in its routine, and when that routine broke, cracks spread quickly. One of the greatest strains came during the An Lushan Rebellion in the mid-8th century. For years, the empire was fractured by war. Armies moved back and forth across provinces, roads were unsafe, and postal stations were destroyed or abandoned. Messages that once flowed with reliability now stalled or vanished altogether. The court in Chang'an, already shaken, found itself blind to distant events. Governors acted with more independence. Soldiers relied on local supplies, and the network that once held the empire together seemed to dissolve, even after the rebellion ended. The postal system was weaker, never quite regaining its earlier steadiness. Later dynasties inherited what remained. The Song, centuries afterward, rebuilt portions of the system, adding their own methods of communication. But they too struggled with the same realities: distance, delay, vulnerability. The Mongols, when they conquered China, created an even larger postal relay system, the famous Yam, with stations spread across their vast empire. In some ways, they perfected what the Tang had begun, but the principle was the same. Empires could not survive without messages. For the Tang, the system was not remembered as glorious in itself. Few poems praised it, few monuments honored it. It was part of the machinery of empire, invisible when it worked, despised when it failed. Yet, in its quiet way, it shaped the daily rhythm of governance as much as armies or taxes. Each letter carried on horseback was a thread in the fabric of state. Without it, the cloth unraveled, even now. When archaeologists uncover fragments of official documents, sealed in clay or pressed onto paper, they glimpse the hum of this system. A record of grain collected, a command sent to a governor, a report of soldiers stationed at a distant post. They are not dramatic, not filled with poetry, but they are the bones of administration. Each one represents a journey, a rider, a horse, a clerk, a station. Each one whispers of the invisible work that kept an empire alive. The ruins of some stations can still be traced, low mounds in the earth where once couriers rested. Travelers' accounts from later centuries describe them as simple places, mud, walls, a fire, a handful of attendants. Nothing about them suggested greatness, and yet, in their monotony, they were vital. The Thames postal system reminds us that power does not always come from spectacle. Sometimes it comes from repetition, from the endless turning of small wheels that no one notices until they stop. And this leaves us with a quiet thought. If empires are bound by words that take weeks to travel, what truly holds them together? Is it the authority of rulers, or is it the anonymous work of clerks and couriers, men who carried the empire on horseback, one dusty mile at a time? When people think of ancient Egypt, they imagine pyramids rising against the sky, golden masks, and pharaohs whose names still echo across millennia. But behind the monuments and the rituals stood another kind of figure, one far less glamorous and far more ordinary, the bureaucrat. These men, seated in offices rather than on thrones, did not rule armies or build temples with their own hands. They counted grain, copied records, and managed taxes. It was their work, tedious and endless, that allowed the pharaohs to appear as gods on earth. Without them, the great civilization of Egypt would have faltered. The Nile River was the heart of Egypt, flooding each year and leaving behind rich soil that fed the people. Yet the floods were unpredictable. Some years the river rose high, filling canals and ensuring abundant harvests. Other years it rose, too little, leaving fields parched, or too much, sweeping away villages. Managing the cycles of the river required constant attention. How much land had been flooded? How many fields were sown? How much grain could be expected? And how much should be stored in state granaries? These were not questions for the pharaoh himself, but for his scribes and administrators, the men who walked the fields, carried tablets and papyrus, and recorded the facts in neat rows of hieroglyphs. Imagine one of these scribes at work. He carries a wooden pallet with two small wells of ink, one black, one red. Reeds cut to sharp points serve as pens. He kneels on the ground beside a farmer's plot, asking questions, checking measures, noting the yield. The farmer may see him as an intruder, someone who arrives not to help but to demand. Yet for the state, his presence is vital. Every measure of barley counted today would be demanded tomorrow as tax. The scribe did not swing a whip or raise a sword, but his writing was power. What he wrote could not easily be denied. The Egyptians built monumental tombs and temples, but they also built archives. Countless rolls of papyrus were stored in offices, recording taxes, labor assignments, census lists, and court rulings. These were the real foundations of pharaonic power. A decree carved in stone might proclaim a king's glory, but it was the papyrus scroll in a clerk's hand that determined of how much grain a village surrendered, or how many men were sent to work on a pyramid. To us, these records seem dull lists of numbers and names, but to Egypt they were life itself. Many of these bureaucrats remain anonymous, their names lost in the endless flow of documents. A few, however, left behind autobiographies carved on tomb walls. They boast not of battles won, but of fairness in collecting taxes, of diligence in managing canals, of honesty in distributing grain during famine. Their pride lay in their orderliness, their devotion to bureaucracy. To them, justice was not a dramatic act, but the careful balance of accounts. The farmers, on the other hand, often viewed the bureaucracy with suspicion. In some surviving texts, peasants complain of scribes who demanded too much, of officials who seized grain unfairly, of corruption hidden beneath the authority of ink. Life along the Nile was shaped as much by floods and droughts as by the calculations of bureaucrats. To give up too much grain meant hunger. To resist meant punishment. The balance was delicate, and the scribe's pen decided it. And yet, for all their unglamorous roles, these officials were honored. In Egyptian art, scribes are often shown seated calmly, scroll in hand, eyes focused, bodies at rest. Their statues are not muscular like those of warriors, but poised, attentive, ready to write. Literacy was rare, and those who possessed it held a kind of magic. To write was to fix words permanently, to make speech endure. In a land obsessed with eternity, the ability to write was sacred. Bureaucrats were not worshipped as gods, but they were respected as the ones who made the kingdom run day after day. They sat in offices, copying figures, checking lists, preparing reports for higher officials. Their work had no end. Once one harvest was counted, another began. Once one batch of laborers was assigned, another was needed. Their lives were repetitive, perhaps dull. Yet it was this very dullness that gave Egypt its stability. Dynasties rose and fell, floods came and went, but the bureaucrats remained, their pens moving steadily, their scrolls piling up, their work binding the kingdom together. And so we see Egypt not only through its pyramids and temples, but through its offices, its storerooms, its archives. The forgotten pharaohs were not only the kings whose names have been eroded from stone, but the bureaucrats whose names were never carved at all. They lived in the shadows, yet the shadows were what allowed the monuments to shine. But this leads to a quiet question. If the true foundation of Egypt was not the pharaoh's divinity, but the bureaucrats' record-keeping, then who really held the power? Was it the king who gave orders, or the scribe who ensured those orders reached every field, every granary, every village along the Nile? The strength of Egypt's bureaucracy lay in its ability to turn the unpredictable Nile into something that felt ordered. Every year, when the floods receded, scribes spread across the countryside with cords and measuring rods. They marked the boundaries of fields, noted how much land had been covered by water, and calculated the expected harvest. These measurements became the basis of taxation, recorded neatly on papyrus rolls that made their way from village offices to provincial centers, and finally to the capital. To the farmers, it must have felt relentless. The river gave, the land produced, and the state arrived to claim its portion. Grain was the lifeblood of Egypt. Surpluses were gathered into granaries, huge mud-brick structures with high walls and narrow entrances. Inside, workers poured sacks of barley or wheat into bins, sealing them for storage. These granaries were not just warehouses, they were symbols of stability. When harvests were plentiful, they promised security for lean years. When harvests failed, they became instruments of control, their supplies rationed by officials who decided who received relief and who went without. The scribes who managed these stores were powerful in ways not always visible. A man's fate in times of famine might depend less on the will of the pharaoh than on the careful or careless record of a clerk. Taxes were not only collected in grain, villages owed labor as well. Teams of men were conscripted to dig canals, repair dikes, or haul blocks for temples and tombs. Bureaucrats assigned quotas, tallying who had served and who had not. The grand monuments of Egypt, from pyramids to colossal statues, stand as silent witnesses to this system. Behind every stone was paperwork, lists of workers, schedules of rations, records of progress. Even eternity was built on bureaucracy. Of course, such a system was never perfect. Corruption crept in, as it does wherever power hides in records. Some scribes inflated numbers to please their superiors. Others skimmed from taxes. Others used their literacy to exploit those who could not read. Evidence survives in complaints carved into petitions, where peasants accused officials of greed or unfairness. A text known as the Satire of the Trades even mocks the lives of farmers, potters, and soldiers, while praising the scribe's life as superior, safe, clean, and powerful. To be a bureaucrat was not only to hold authority, but to escape the harsher burdens of manual labor. Still, the bureaucracy had its ideals. Many autobiographies of officials carved on tombs emphasize fairness and justice. "I gave bread to the hungry," one reads. "I did not cheat in the weights. I did not increase the tax." These inscriptions are not only boasts, but attempts to show that bureaucracy could be moral, that the scribe's duty was not simply to extract, but to preserve balance. In Egypt, the idea of matador, justice, harmony, was central, and bureaucrats saw themselves, or wanted to be seen, as agents of Mat. To keep records was to keep the world steady. For higher officials, bureaucracy offered a path to influence. While the pharaoh was the supreme authority, his court depended on layers of administrators, viziers, overseers, tax collectors, record keepers. These men shaped policy by the way they reported numbers, by how they organized resources, by what they chose to emphasize or hide. A king might decree the building of a temple, but it was the bureaucrats who made it happen, arranging supplies, assigning workers, and monitoring progress. Their power was quiet but immense, woven into every decision of the state. The scribes themselves were often trained from childhood, memorizing texts and practicing calculations. Students filled broken pottery shards with practice exercises, writing the same phrases again and again until they could reproduce them without error. Those who succeeded gained entry into the ranks of the bureaucracy. Those who failed returned to farming or labor. Literacy was the gate that separated the bureaucrat from the common man, and the gate was narrow. Through this machinery, Egypt functioned like a vast organism, The pharaoh was its head, the farmers its body, but the bureaucrats were its nerves transmitting information, recording responses, keeping every part in communication with the rest. Without them, orders could not reach villages, and taxes could not flow back to the capital. They were not remembered with statues of gold or temples of stone, but their scrolls and records are as much a monument as the pyramids. And yet there is unease in their story. If power is held not by the one who commands, but by the one who records, then where does authority truly lie? Was Egypt ruled by divine kingship, or was it ruled by paper and ink, by the hands of clerks? Who decided what was written, what was erased, and what was never recorded at all? The bureaucracy of ancient Egypt was not bound to a single dynasty or ruler. It endured through centuries, surviving the rise and fall of kings, adapting to new circumstances, reshaping itself as needed. When one pharaoh died and another took the throne, the scribes remained at their desks, copying, calculating, measuring. Floods still came, taxes still needed to be collected, granaries still had to be filled. Bureaucracy was the true constant, flowing beneath the surface of political change like the Nile itself, even in times of crisis. When drought struck or invasions threatened, the machinery of record-keeping persisted. Some papyri from the late periods of Egypt show accounts of famine relief, carefully logged, line by line. Others preserve court cases, disputes between farmers over land or inheritance. These documents remind us that while kings fought wars or raised monuments, ordinary life continued, and bureaucracy shaped its rhythm. People lived not under the shadow of pyramids, but under the weight of taxes, receipts, and records. Later cultures admired Egypt's stability, but they also borrowed its methods. The Greeks who conquered Egypt under Alexander found themselves inheriting an already elaborate system of administration. The Ptolemaic kings that followed did not abolish the bureaucracy. They used it. Greek officials sat beside Egyptian scribes, the two traditions mingling. Later, when Rome took Egypt as a province, the same structures endured. Roman governors relied on local scribes to manage land surveys, harvest records, and tax collection. Even as rulers changed, the system of paperwork remained to modern eyes. What survives from this bureaucracy may look unremarkable. Fragments of papyrus covered in lists of grain deliveries, receipts for payments, notes about canal repairs. But in these fragments lies the endurance of a civilization. They show not only how Egypt functioned, but how it thought of itself, balanced, tied to the cycles of the Nile, and to the belief that every detail, no matter how small, mattered in maintaining the harmony of the world. Some scribes achieved immortality through their writing. Their names appear in texts praising their profession, boasting that a scribe's words would outlast stone. In a way, they were right. Pharaoh's statues crumbled, tombs were looted, but papyri still carried the neat lines of men who lived 3,000 years ago. Their handwriting is their legacy, dull to some, but miraculous in its survival. The bureaucrats of Egypt were rarely remembered as heroes, yet their presence was felt everywhere. They were the invisible architects of order, turning floods into numbers, numbers into taxes, taxes into monuments, and monuments into eternity. Their work was slow, repetitive, and often thankless, but it was this very work that made Egypt more than a collection of villages along a river. It made it a state, a kingdom, a civilization that lasted longer than almost any other in history. And so the question lingers: was the greatness of Egypt truly in its pyramids, its temples, and its kings? Or was it in the scrolls of papyrus, tucked away in storerooms, the patient work of scribes whose names are mostly forgotten? If eternity is built on paper and ink, then perhaps the real pharaohs were not those who wore crowns, but those who held pens. In the quiet world of medieval Europe, monasteries stood as islands of order. Their stone walls enclosed not only chapels and libraries, but also gardens, workshops, and kitchens. Life inside was governed by the rhythm of bells, marking hours for prayer, study, and labor. Among all the duties the monks performed, one of the most essential was also one of the most ordinary: baking bread. Bread was not just food, it was sustenance, ritual, and daily necessity. And yet, in the kitchens of monasteries, bread took all day to make. The process began before dawn. A monk assigned to the kitchen would rise in the cold and dark, his breath clouding in the air as he lit the fire in the oven. These ovens were great domed structures of clay or stone. Their mouths, blackened with soot, they did not burn constantly. They had to be heated in advance. Logs were stacked inside and set alight, the flames roaring until the chamber glowed with heat. Hours later, the fire was raked out, leaving only the stored warmth of the stone. It was in this retained heat that bread would bake slowly, evenly, filling the monastery with the smell of flour and smoke. Meanwhile, the dough itself had to be prepared. Flour was sifted, often coarsely ground, from the monastery's own fields. It was mixed with water and a bit of old dough saved from the day before, a natural leaven that gave the bread its rise. Yeast was not understood in a scientific sense, but monks knew the value of patience. Dough had to rest and swell, sometimes for hours, covered with cloths to keep out dust and insects. The rising was slow, and nothing could be rushed. Bread could not be hurried, no matter how hungry the monks might be. As the dough rested, the kitchen did not fall silent. Other foods were prepared: vegetables from the garden, fish from the river, perhaps a little cheese. The rule of Saint Benedict, which shaped monastic life, emphasized simplicity. Meals were plain, meat was rare, and bread was the foundation. The monks did not eat for pleasure, but for sustenance, and bread was the most dependable form of sustenance they had. It could be stored, carried, and eaten with almost anything. Every monk, from the abbot to the youngest novice, relied on it. When the dough had risen enough, it was shaped into loaves, often round and thick. The baker's hands worked with quiet repetition, kneading, pressing, folding. Dozens of loaves might be made in a day, each nearly identical to the next. They were set aside once more, allowed to rise again before baking. The oven, by now, had cooled to the proper heat. The loaves were slid in with long wooden paddles, the door sealed with a heavy stone or clay cover. And then came more waiting. Hours passed as the loaves browned slowly, the smell spreading through the cloisters. Bread in the monastery was rarely soft or delicate. It was dense, heavy, and filling. Coarse flour meant rough textures, bits of husk and grain in every bite. Yet it was nutritious, sustaining the monks through long days of prayer, labor, and study. Bread was not just food, it was also symbolic. In Christian tradition, bread was tied to the body of Christ, blessed and broken in rituals that gave it meaning beyond the table. To bake bread was not only to feed the body, but to serve the spirit. The work of the monastery kitchen was repetitive and often thankless. Fires to be lit, flour to be sifted, dough to be shaped, loaves to be stored. Day after day, the same motions were repeated, each one necessary, none of them glorious. Yet without the kitchen, the monastery could not function. Learning, prayer, copying manuscripts, these depended on food, and food depended on bread. The monks who labored in the kitchen may not have been remembered in chronicles, but their work was as essential as that of the scholars who copied texts or the abbots who led prayers. Bread took all day to bake, not because the monks were slow, but because the process itself demanded time. Heat had to build, dough had to rise, patience had to be observed. It was a rhythm of waiting, of trusting that slow labor would yield sustenance. In its slowness lay its meaning. Bread was never just placed on a table. It was prepared, cared for, and earned through hours of work. And so, in the monastery kitchen, the most ordinary of foods became the anchor of daily life. While chants echoed in the chapel and scribes bent over manuscripts in the scriptorium, the smell of baking bread drifted through the cloisters, reminding everyone that the body must be fed as faithfully as the soul. But it leaves us with a quiet question. Was the monastery truly sustained by prayer and devotion, or was it the steady work of kitchens and ovens, where bread was baked one loaf at a time, that held the community together? The kitchen of a medieval monastery was not only a place of fire and flour, but of order. Everything had its rhythm, just as the monastery itself moved by the tolling of bells. At certain hours, the monks prayed, at others they worked, and at others they ate. The kitchen fit neatly into this cycle. Bread had to be ready at the appointed time. Meals had to be served without delay, and nothing was wasted. To live in a monastery was to live inside a structure of discipline, and the kitchen was no exception. Food was rationed carefully. The rule of Saint Benedict specified 2 meals a day in most seasons, one at midday, another in the evening. Each meal was plain but filling: bread, vegetables, legumes, sometimes fish, rarely meat. Wine or ale might be given in modest amounts, enough for nourishment but never for indulgence. Portions were measured so that no monk ate more than another. To overeat was to break discipline. To take more than one's share was to break harmony. The kitchen, therefore, became a place of fairness, its rations reflecting the ideal of equality that the monastery sought to uphold. The bread itself was divided with care. Loaves were baked in bulk, then portioned according to the number of monks in residence. Large monasteries might feed hundreds, their ovens working constantly to keep pace. Smaller ones required less, but the principle was the same. Every man received his portion, no more and no less. Sometimes surplus bread was given to the poor at the gates, a reminder that charity extended beyond the cloister walls. The act of baking thus became both service and duty, not just to the monks, but to the wider community. The organization of the kitchen reflected the hierarchy of the monastery. At the top stood the cellarer, an official responsible for food, supplies, and the smooth running of daily life. He ensured that the ovens were stocked with wood, the storerooms filled with flour, the meals prepared on time. Below him were the cooks and kitchen monks, men whose days were spent in labor rather than in study. They rose early, worked hard, and rarely received recognition, yet their tasks were as sacred as copying scripture or chanting prayers. In monastic thought, all work was holy if done with devotion, and baking bread was no exception. The process of baking was itself a discipline, the kneading of dough, the tending of fires, the measuring of rations. Each act was a form of obedience, an offering of labor to God. The kitchen was not noisy or chaotic, but deliberate, carried out in silence or with only a few words exchanged. In many monasteries, monks observed strict silence during meals and much of the day. In the kitchen, too, this silence was often kept. The sound of dough being slapped on a wooden table, of ovens being scraped and loaded, replaced chatter. The absence of words made even the most ordinary work feel like ritual. Monasteries often grew much of their own food. Fields nearby produced wheat or barley. Vegetables grew in cloister gardens. Orchards provided fruit. Grain was milled in water-powered mills owned by the monastery, ensuring a steady supply of flour. The entire cycle of life revolved around self-sufficiency, and bread was the clearest expression of that cycle. From field to mill to oven to table, the monastery oversaw every step. Nothing was purchased if it could be grown or made within the walls. This autonomy was not only practical but symbolic, showing that the community could sustain itself, separate from the world outside. The bread, heavy and coarse, carried with it the discipline of this life. It was not meant to delight the tongue, but to strengthen the body. To chew a rough crust, to eat slowly, to swallow with effort, these were reminders of humility. In the monastery, food was never meant to be a source of luxury. Even abundance was tempered by restraint. Festivals and holy days might allow for sweeter breads, enriched with honey or fruit, but most days were marked by the same plain loaves, baked with care but without indulgence. This monotony, rather than being seen as dull, was considered virtuous. To eat the same bread each day was to embrace stability. To repeat the same tasks in the kitchen was to embrace obedience. The monks did not seek novelty or change. They sought constancy. In their constancy, they believed, lay a reflection of eternity. The oven fired each morning. The loaves were baked. The meals were served. The cycle repeated endlessly. And yet, it raises a thought. Was this discipline truly spiritual, or was it simply survival disguised as devotion? Did the bread symbolize holiness because it fed the soul, or because it was the one food that could reliably feed the body? Bread in the monastery was more than sustenance. It was a symbol. To break bread at the table was to share in the community, to affirm that no monk lived for himself alone. The loaves, divided equally, reminded the brothers that they were bound, not by wealth or blood, but by discipline and devotion. In the chapel, bread was consecrated in the Mass, becoming sacred. In the refectory, bread was eaten in silence, nourishing the body. The same food bridged the ordinary and the divine, weaving spiritual meaning into daily routine. For the monks, this connection was constant. Each act of baking carried echoes of Scripture, the feeding of the multitude, the Last Supper, the image of Christ as the bread of life. The simplicity of the food gave it power. To eat was to remember, to be reminded that the divine was present even in the rough crust of a loaf pulled from a smoky oven. The kitchen, though far from the altar, was itself a place of devotion. Beyond the walls of monasteries, the bread they baked reached further than the monks themselves. Travelers found food at monastic guest houses. The poor found relief at monastery gates. Villages nearby traded with monks for surplus loaves. In this way, the slow rhythm of baking extended into the world outside, linking cloisters to communities. Monasteries were not only places of prayer, but centers of production, and their bread sustained more than those who lived within. Over time, the methods refined in monasteries influenced wider medieval society. Techniques of milling, baking, and storing grain spread outward, shaping how villages and towns managed their food. The discipline of the monks, their insistence on careful measurement and patient labor, became part of the larger culture. What was born in silence behind stone walls gradually seeped into the kitchens of ordinary people, though without the same ritual weight. Yet the symbolism remained. Bread was not just food. It was a measure of stability, of whether the harvest was good, of whether famine loomed. In monasteries, this symbolism was heightened, tied to faith and devotion. For those outside, it was tied to survival. In both cases, bread was life itself, carrying meaning beyond its simple ingredients of flour, water, and salt. When we look back now, we see the monasteries as centers of prayer, scholarship, and preservation of knowledge. But behind all of that was the kitchen, the oven, the steady work of men who rose in the dark to light fires and knead dough. The manuscripts they copied might have preserved wisdom, but the bread they baked preserved bodies. The two were inseparable. Without bread, there could be no study, no prayer, no song. And so the monastery kitchen, smoky and monotonous, stands as one of the quiet foundations of medieval life. Its work was slow, repetitive, and ordinary, yet in its slowness lay its strength. Bread was baked every day, just as prayers were spoken every day, just as bells rang every day. Continuity was the essence of the monastery, and bread was its most tangible expression. But it leaves us with a thought. If the holiness of a monastery rested as much on the baking of bread as on the chanting of prayers, then what truly sustains a community, its lofty ideals or its humble daily labors? The Byzantine Empire, successor to Rome, is often remembered for its glittering churches, its emperors in jeweled robes, and its endless wars with Persians, Arabs, and later Turks. Yet beneath the shining mosaics and the clash of armies was a quieter power, one that did not wear armor or wield a sword. It was the power of paperwork. Taxes, calculated and collected year after year, funded the empire's armies, its bureaucracy, and its survival. And behind these taxes stood the officials whose pens carried more weight than spears. The tax collectors, the Byzantines, inherited Rome's love of administration and took it further. Their empire stretched across lands rich and poor, from the fertile plains of Anatolia to the rugged hills of the Balkans. To govern such diversity required more than decrees from emperors. It required a steady flow of money, and money required taxes. Land was measured, crops were estimated, households were counted. Officials traveled villages with tablets, codices, and lists, asking not for loyalty in words, but for payment in coin or kind. Imagine a small village in Anatolia in the 10th century. The fields have just been harvested, the grain gathered in storage pits and barns. The villagers feel relief. But soon after, the imperial tax collector arrives. He is not a soldier, though he is accompanied by guards. He is not a priest, though he carries authority. He sits in the village square, unrolls his records, and begins to call names. Each household comes forward with what is owed: sacks of wheat, jars of oil, or silver coins if they have them. The amounts are noted, checked, against lists, sealed into record books that will travel back to the provincial capital